Ayun no. Medyo nauna eh. Medyo akala ko 2, 3, 2, 1 tapos na. Yung pala, andyan na pala kayo. Ayan na, nabubulol na tayo. Ayan na, ayan na. Parang lalong lumalala yata yung sitwasyon. Nako po, sabi ko muni-muni tayo. Baka medyo maging mas good mood tayo. Lalong talagang just when you think it's bad, they keep on digging it in. No? So, mula kahapon, nakita natin na in the press cons, ang dami nangyayari mga, ah, mga follow-up stories, para mga ganon, para Marvels, may mga next editions pang ganon. Ayan, medyo windang pa rin tayo dito sa issue na yan. Okay, so, mukhang si Lacson ay nagdi-disown dun sa whole LENI withdraw drama. Tapos yung iba, sinisisi pa yung media. Bakit nagtatanong yung media? Bakit? Kung hindi kayo nagtanong, di sana sinabi yan. Ayan na naman tayo eh. Sisisihin pa yung media. As if naman yung media nag-feed ng mga sagot. And then, may mga tao dyan sa kampo ni Yorme ISKO naman na nagsasabi, ay, hindi kami nag-isip ng ano yan, yung withdraw LENI yan. Inisip lang namin na mag-organize nito. So, pati yung mga ibang campaign people dyan sa kampo ni Yorme ISKO ay hindi rin masyado na-impress doon sa nangyari. So, mukhang they were behind organizing this unity without anyone dropping out press conference. But mukhang hindi nila na-foresee na medyo magkaroon ng loose cannon effect dyan. Which is quite surprising because considering Yorme ISKO is known as someone who speaks his mind and sometimes perhaps a tad too much, a tad too aggressive, no? Pati nga aminado siya na medyo magaspang siya minsan. I mean, that's cute to a certain degree, but if you overdo it or misplace it or wala sa konteksto, wala sa timing, pwede mag-backfire yan. So, katulad ng pinangako natin, balikan ko kayo, mga classroom, nag-research na kayo, mga ka-interregnum, mga kakampink, mga kaka-isko, mga kapakman, mga ka-antman, yan, mga ka-GMRC. Ayan, nag-research na ba kayo? Tuloy, nakalimutan ko yung greetings eh. Alam ko yan ang dapat pasok natin, ganitong greetings ng mga, kamusta dyan, mga ka-GMRC, mga ka-Pacman, ka-Antman, ka-Camping, ka-Isko. Dapat ganon. Wala eh. Medyo windang pa rin tayo. Yan. So ito, may notes tayo ngayon ha. Let's go through our notes. Ayan, nagtalagang, tayo. Take note tayo today ha. Okay. So, kung pansin nyo today, dito sa Inquirer, mayroon akong article kay ISKO. Hindi ko muna i-share kasi babash nyo lang ako eh. Parang hindi rin tama yata ang timing ito eh. Ang title ay, ISKO Moreno, The Dark Horse. Tapos may question mark. Ayan na, may mga nag-troll dyan, hindi dark horse, dark sheep daw. Ayan, black sheep daw. Ayan na naman tayo, tinitroll nyo naman yung mga natin. Ayan tayo, tinitroll nyo yung titles natin. Pag-usapan natin yan kasi pag-usapan ko rin si President Zelensky because not long ago, Zelensky was also being attacked as a kind of a young trapo, a big disappointment, etc. But man, he has had his moment of redemption. Big time, no? Pero balikan ko yan, no? Balikan ko tong issue na ito. Kasi I think we have to go back to some basics here. Mamaya, medyo magkakaroon tayo ng subscription-based lecture series. Char! Hindi. Mamaya yan. Mga sabihin nila, itong si Dario, nagbe-business na. Nagba-vlogger na. Kasi alam mo, mahirap mag-lecture. Mahirap mag-prepare ng notes, PowerPoints, mag-set up pa ako, mag-download pa ako, papakita ko mga PowerPoints. Alam niyo naman, pag tayo ay nag-present sa mga dyan, alam niyo naman dyan, di ba? Pero alam mo naman tayo, we're here for public education to help folks to raise the level of education. So go tayo! So katulad ng pinag-usapan natin kahapon, we'll try to learn some new concepts and try to break down these new concepts and see the relevance dito sa discussion natin. And of course today, dito sa discussion natin kay ISKO. Pag-usapan po natin unang-una yung konsepto ng median voter. So kung familiar po kayo sa statistics, ayan na, magda-nosebleed na yung iba. Ayan na. Nagda-drop na yung engagement natin. Sabi ko lang statistics. Alam niyo naman yung difference among mean, median, and mode. Diba? Siyempre, yung mean is yung average. So, for instance, 5 plus 3 plus 2. So, 10 divided by 3, 3.333. Okay, gets yun na. Okay, so parang average na yan, diba? Pero medyo iba yung mode and median. Yung median, kukunin mo yung dalawang extremes. So, kukunin mo yung siguro yung 5 and 3, divided mo by 2, 4 ang makukuha mo, hindi 3.333. Right? So, medyo iba yung kukunin mo, for instance. And then doon sa mode naman, ang makukuha mo dyan is, for instance, you have a situation whereby 5, 3, 3, 1, yung mode mo dyan is 3. So, kukunin mo yung pinaka high frequency numbers na nag-occur dun sa list na yan. Ito medyo nagsastat tayo dyan. Mga ka-perfect attendance, Oxford man, yeah. Graduate boy, yon. Mga Talanos. Makinig kayo dyan ha. Ito, so mean, median, mode. Pinag-usapan po natin yan sa statistics. Now, sa political science po, may konsepto na tinatawag na median voter. Na parang medyo maraming natuwa doon na parang hindi masyadong gumagana for some reason. But it's a heuristically helpful and potentially electorally helpful concept. So balikan natin yung concept ng interregnum, no? Pinag-usapan natin, si Tatay Digong ay isang representation ng interregnum. In short, like a limbo, like a twilight, like a, yung nakalutang. Nakalutang tayo. Yan ang interregnum. Okay. Of course, I explained it in a much more, I would say, sophisticated prose dun sa article natin previously. But today, let's talk about the concept of median voter. Because I think this is a very important one because it's connected to another concept, the concept of centrism or political centrism. Now, relevant ito dahil nakikita natin around the world, political centrism po ay ginagamit ng iba't ibang kampo, especially anti-establishment, outside the box, young leaders to get into the political fray and sometimes with a lot of success. So in fact, if you look at Europe, for instance, Angela Merkel, the former chancellor, she was the embodiment of political centrism. So yung ginagawa ni Merkel is to bring the elements of political left and political right together. So for instance, yung political right sa Germany po ay very focused sa issue ng fiscal discipline. Ayaw nila gastos-gastos, ayaw nila pautang-utang lang. Dun sa foreign policy, sabihin natin na siguro medyo closer to America, for instance, no? Dun sa political left naman, focus sila sa issue ng labor, ng wages, ng benefits sa mga nanay, sa mga, mga single parent, more support for refugees, no? Green environmental policy. So yung ginawa ni Merkel is, kinuha niya yung pareho. Nilagay na together, gumawa siya ng bagong synthesis. And that essentially was the secret to success of Angela Merkel for almost 16 years in power, right? I mean, she's considered as the most influential German leader since some would say Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck. Hindi natin pag-usapan yung Austrian Hitler na yan. Ibang usapan yan. So Merkel is, I think, the representation of the most successful form of centrism in recent memory, no? And the fact that a woman was able to pull it off in not necessarily the most, let's say, non-patriarchal or egalitarian societies, that's quite something. Now, I'm not saying Germany is super patriarchal, but let's be honest, they haven't had many female chancellors in modern history, right? Diba? Sino pa ba aside from Angela Merkel, diba? Magpangalan kayo, tingnan natin. Sino pa ba? Okay. So, US na nga, wala pa nga silang presidenteng babae. Tingnan mo talaga. Okay. Mas advanced tayo sa kanila in certain ways sa gender equity and all. Okay. Now, we have someone else na, of course, medyo kilala niyo dapat at medyo pinag-usapan natin in some of our discussions, si French President Emmanuel Macron. And if you remember, Macron ran for the presidency in his 30s, no? So, papunta pa lang siya ng 40, di pa siya nagfo-40, tumatakbo na siyang bilang presidente ng France. A flagship democracy, the first modern republic, at least in Europe, no? So, dito, ang ginawa talaga ni Macron is essentially ginagaya niya si Merkel but adding some cool effect, some youthful effect, some je ne sais quoi, some stylish effect, no? So yun ang ginawa niya. But essentially, if you look at the policies of Macron, it's also a hodgepodge. And if you look at yung coalition niya, may hodgepodge din. Meron yung mga ex-left, ex-socialist. Siya mismo ay kinda ex-socialist. He used to work in the former socialist government of François Hollande. But there's also the right-wing element. Yung pro-market reforms, new liberal reforms, yung more oriented towards financial liberalization, etc. And of course, si Macron, one thing that made him quite famous globally is that he speaks very good English, which is, I mean, no offense to our French friends. I mean, they're not necessarily best known for speaking the best English, at least back in the day. Although, in fairness, my experience in Paris just recently quite corrected that stereotype. No, in fairness to our French friends, no, I mean, they're much more internationalized. So we see a lot of political leaders in recent memory, quite successful ones, using centrist strategy to win political power. At ang base dun sa strategy na yan is yung konsepto ng median voter. So the idea of Angela Merkel, the idea of Emmanuel Macron, and I would argue you can talk about Mario Draghi in Italia. I can go on and on. Yes, Joseph Biden. Joseph Biden is another case of centrism. Right? So if you look at Joseph Biden, meron siyang environmental welfare policies na medyo left. At the same time, he's tough on China, tough on foreign policy, medyo strong on the military front, etc. So yun, again, nakikita natin na Biden also is perhaps the embodiment, the most powerful embodiment of political centrism in our era. So all of these leaders, what they do is that they have the concept of a median voter in their mind. So the median voter is more or less like how we calculate it. Look at the two extremes, find the midpoint between that. In fact, my idea is better to even look at mode voter rather than median voter, although it doesn't sound as nice. But technically, statistically speaking, I think that's more correct. Ang idea dyan is, titignan mo yung biases, prejudices, preferences ng hindi yung dalawang kampo na nag-aaway. Yung dalawang extreme camp. Titignan mo yung midpoint sa kanila o yung mga pinakamaraming ordinaryong tao na hindi masyadong attached or entrenched dun sa mga nag-aaway ng iba't ibang kampo. Because usually, of course, politics tends to be bipolar, right? You have two major poles, right? Fighting against each other, different narratives. In some countries, you have clear two-party systems, etc. So essentially what centrism does is to find a kind of a midpoint between those two and try to figure out ano yung gusto ng isang ordinaryong voter, undecided voter, independent voter, soft Democrat, soft Republican, however you want to put it, na hindi kasama dun sa mga dalawang extreme side na napaka-entrenched, napaka-partisan, napaka-polarized. And in fact, the centrist strategy with the focus on median voter is very, very important dun sa mga bansa who have been undergoing extreme periods of political polarization. Of course, Germany is one of the worst in modern history. Grabe yung dinaanan in Germany during the fall of the Weimar Republic, etc., so on and so forth. But, of course, yung US, recently nakita natin, also very polarized. In France, they went from Sarkozy on the right, and then they jumped to Hollande on the left. So, essentially, Macron said, let's stick to the center and try to figure out something. And his centrism actually pushed. Now, if you look at yung kalaban niya ngayon, di ba? Si Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen is also moving a little bit to the center para to be more appealing. So, ang labanan dito is center-right versus center-far-right. Something like that, no? So, the idea of median voter is important because ngayon, balikan natin ang Pilipinas. Because if you look at Grace Poe's campaign in 2016, if you look at Isko Moreno's campaign in 2022, there's a lot of similarity. And in fact, base sa alam ko, Isko actually supported Poe in 2016, not Tatay Digong, right? And in many ways, their populisms are very similar. It's more the era FPJ kind of populism than Digong, Modi, Bolsonaro kind of populism. It's not strongman populism, right? It's quite a different kind of populism. I think it's even much closer to Binay kind of populism than Duterte kind of populism, right? Now, I have multiple terms for that. I use different terms. I use polite populism, so on and so forth. So, if you look at it, ang calculation ng dalawang kampo na yan, both po in 2016 and also uh, ISKO in 2022 is that if titignan mo yung average voter, yung median voter, hindi sila masyadong invested doon sa dalawang narratives. Let's call it the two poles, right? So one pole is obviously the Marcosian, Talano Gold, all of that stuff, and then the other pole is, you know, we were saved by this family and everything like that. Alam niyo na yan, liberal versus Marcos and all. Now, Duterte kind of came in, tried to create the third front, but somehow he tilted more towards the Marcos side, therefore paving the way for the Marcoses to get even stronger. But if you look at ISKO's strategy, parang ang basa nila dito is, if titignan mo yung average, again, median voter sa Pilipinas, again, if titignan mo yung median voter sa Pilipinas, hindi sila pro-Marcos necessarily. That's why Marcos had, he was just 13%, right? In the surveys last year, no? Nung time na almost 30% si Sara, di ba? Number 3 pa nga siya behind ISKO. At the same time, hindi rin sila masyado, this is it. The idea is that the median voter also in the Philippines, hindi masyadong invested sa mga prinsipyo at narratives na vinavalue ng Liberal Party or progressives or the LENI camp, among others, right? Which is, of course, dapat pigilan ng mga Marcoses to come back fully to power, yung idea ng human rights, civil liberties, our alliances with the West, so on and so forth. So if you look at the median voter in the Philippines, the tendency is that they are keeping an open mind. An average, again, a median, I don't want to use the word average, the median voter in the Philippines, in fact, broadly supported President Duterte. Now, I have my own doubts whether President Duterte was ever really 80-90% and all. I mean, hindi naman tayo Russia, pero minsan parang yung mga survey, I mean, how much can you trust a survey in a climate of fear and disinformation and all? You have to take it with a grain of salt. I'm not questioning the methodology or integrity of the survey agencies. I'm just talking about the climate. No? Now, by and large though, I mean, just go around and talk to people randomly. Hindi lang dun sa barangay mo lang or kung taga Makati ka or BGC ka, hindi lang doon or hindi lang sa mga echo chambers mo. Lumabas ka sa echo chambers mo, kausapin mo. Yung mga, you know, random people from all walks of life. Try mo yan. Nagagawa ko yan, by the way. Maniwala kayo sa akin. Alam mo naman, kwela tayo, kahit sino makakausap ko. Minsan nakasando lang ako baba, pupuntang karinderya, kausapin ko si kuya, kausapin ko yung gano'n. Yung iba, hindi ako nakikilala, so mas open sila. Yung iba, medyo kilala ako, so medyo ano. Basta lahat, talagang literally, kwentong barbero minsan. Diba? Doon mo gets, actually, the median Filipino voter is not too dissatisfied with President Duterte. President Duterte is more or less acceptable to the median Filipino voter, no? And in 2016, I think when Poe was also running, the idea was the median voter is not super against the Joseph Estrada or Binay types. That these types, you know, they're more or less acceptable to the median voter. I mean, that perhaps was kind of the calculation. Kaya you still play this populist card, but the other thing is, the median Filipino voter, no, if you look at it also, and I'll give you some evidence later on, hindi ito, ano lang, haka lang. You can check, for instance, yung pinost ko dyan, natag ko at the top of my page, yung latest publication ko with Cambridge University Press, Subaltern Populism. I cite some works and numbers there. Also, in another piece I had with Cambridge University Press, Emerging Market Populism. Now, if you look at it, the median Filipino voter is not too invested in the pro-Marcos narrative, not also invested too much in the anti-Marcos, pro-human rights, civil liberties narrative. They're more interested in a leader who has a certain degree of parang accessibility, yung certain degree na medyo kampante ka sa kanya, may certain degree of reassuring strength, and also someone who can deliver the basics. Just the very basics. Matinong infrastruktura, ayusin yung traffic sa EDSA, ayusin yung pagkakulang ng bridges, infrastruktura, eskwela, dyan sa probinsya. So the median Filipino voter is not as ideologically charged as those invested in the two extreme camps. Right. Now, again, I'll be very clear. I'm not drawing a moral equivalence between the two camps. As I said, ibang usapan yung Oxford man, perfect attendance, ibang usapan yung mga atake kay Len, yung mga ganon. Okay? I'm not drawing an equivalence between the two of them. Obviously, yung isa nag-graduate, 2 degrees pa. At hindi kailangan yan pa. Now, ibang usapan yan. Okay. By the way, this is not about graduating not. This is about people having all the money and support and all, and yet not graduating and lying about it. That's a big issue for me. I'm sorry. Anyway, mga rich kid style. Okay. Now, balikan natin itong issue na to. So, if you look at the average median voter. Now, median voter can be a manager in a company, could be a driver, could be a yaya. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to do anything with socioeconomic class. Kasi kung titignan mo yung votes ni Duterte, he's more or less even. In fact, higher pa siya among ABC. If you look at Bongbong Marcos' surveys, he's more or less even across different classes. He's higher, I think, in ABC than one of either E or D or something like that. So it's not just massa or it's not just middle class. There's no way you can win an elections in the Philippines unless you're talking about cases like 1992, etc. Kung wala kang significant plurality of support in all major classes, socioeconomic classes. So when you talk about median voter, it cuts across socioeconomic classes. It cuts across also ethnic, tribal lines and linguistic fault lines. Now, if you look at it, let me give you some numbers. So look at two things, for instance. Let me Google this out para makikita nyo. Ayan, low-tech kasi tayo. Ayan, lalabas ko yan. So there are two surveys that actually caught my attention, especially when I was writing the book on President Duterte. Andito pa yung book ko. Ayan, doon pa sa kabila. Nakakatamad pa maglakad. Next time, pakita ko. Diyan yung graphs doon sa libro ko eh. One is, you can check it on your own. One is Pew Survey, Pew Research Center Survey. The other one you have to check is World Value Survey. So these are the two surveys I look at. Yes, I mean, SWS and politicians have surveys in democracy and all, but to be honest, I think these international surveys give you a better comparative perspective. And that helped me to also understand na yung ating similaridad, no, sa ating mga kapitbahay katulad ng Indonesia, Thailand, or even India and Turkey and those countries na meron din mga tatay, mga yan. I haven't checked as much Hungary na may tatay din na Viktor Orban, but I wouldn't be surprised the numbers are actually quite similar. Okay, let me just pull out this survey para you can see that it's just one of the surveys that confirms essentially what I've been saying, whereby it says that the median voter in the Philippines, no, is on average actually open to an authoritarian leader if that leader is capable of providing essentially basic services and basic goods. Competency. So competency po ang primary na hinahanap, primary characteristics na hinahanap ng isang median voter, no? Beyond yung ideological, value-based, morality-based debates or even historically grounded debates about who did what, when, how, for whom, etc. All of those kinds of things, no? Sorry, dapat pinrepare ko siguro yan, no? Dami kong naiisip eh. Ilalabas ko to para makita to yung survey niyan. Ipopost ko yan sa baba. Don't worry about it. I'm gonna repost these things. And then, I don't want to do it now. Hintayin ko siguro after elections, God willing. Maybe we can have a much more in-depth discussions about this, no? Hindi muna ngayon. Okay, eto na. So, ilalabas ko sa inyo to, para makikita niyo yung sinasabi ko sa median voter. Okay. So, this will give you an idea of a median voter. So, the question is, on commitment to, ganun natin para mas malaki. The question is in terms of commitment to representative or liberal democracy. So, they ask people, voters in Philippines, Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Australia, South Korea, Japan, US, and Britain. No? So yung blue na nakikita niyo yung blue? Nakikita niyo yung blue? Ito yung number of people na tinanong, no? Median voters, diba? Ang gusto mo maintindihan, ano yung median voters? Ito yung number of people who have been categorically committed to a representative democracy. Human rights, civil liberties, institutional checks and balances, and all. Yung dilaw na nakikita mo, yan ang ayaw sa dilaw sa Pilipinas, right? Yan, 67% were less committed to liberal democracy. 12% were against representative liberal democracy. So if you put those two together, 67 plus 12, Malaki number yan. Malaki number yan. You're talking about more than 8 out of 10 Filipinos. You see all of this? This is Philippines. Nakita mo lahat ng dilaw na yan? Tapos gray na yan? Lahat yan open sa leader na hindi necessarily liberal democratic. Do you get what I'm talking about here? Now, these numbers are not out of nowhere. If you go to earlier years of World Value Survey, 2014, etc., these numbers were, the trend lines were already there. Now, 6 out of 10 Filipinos were skeptical of whether democracy was delivering the promises. In our case, whether the EDSA revolution gave us what we were looking for. So again, to put it in context. Now, if you look at it, the situation is even worse in Indonesia, yung number 2, and India. Mas konti pa sa dalawang bansa nito na fully committed sa representative democracy. At mas marami pa sa India at Indonesia na open sa authoritarian leader or populist leader or whatever, right? So this will give you an idea of what is a median voter sa Philippines. The median Filipino voter is not invested in a liberal democratic representative democracy system. That's just the truth. Now, I can give you multiple surveys to show that. Yes, it is true. I agree with SWS and all that majority of Filipinos, 9 out of 10 at least, want us to have elections. But elections alone are not an indicator of democracy. You can have elections. They have elections in, I don't know. I mean, in Russia, they have elections. Does anyone believe it's a democracy? Of course, it's not a democracy, right? Belarus has elections. Singapore has elections. So, even North Korea ata may election din. So this is what I'm talking about. Yung laking dilaw na nakikita mo dyan, yan, lahat yan, dyan mo mahanap yung median voter na Pilipino. Now, my sense is, these numbers were quite different, I would say 15 or 20 years ago, perhaps. Perhaps the numbers were a little bit more blue, a little bit less gray, and then a little bit siguro dilaw na gitna. Pero blue would swap. So siguro will be much closer to where, let's say, South Korea is. So this is South Korea. So South Korea has 31%. 1 out of 3 are fully committed to represent democracy. 47% are not. And 13 are actually for non-democratic leadership. And guess what happened in South Korea? They just elected a Trumpian figure as their new president. A prosecutor, hardline, conservative, populist, demagogue, some would even say misogynist, but at the same time quite anti-China guy. No? So that's South Korea. So that's South Korea, right? Now, Philippines is only here. Look at how small the fully committed. Now, look at the number of support for LENI. Right? Look at their numbers. 24%, it hasn't reached 30% yet. So you can sense that this 15% here, perhaps a lot of them, plus some here dito sa Dilaw, you put them together, that's where you get LENI. That means if you're Bongbong Marcos or other candidates, you have all of this to work through. So, what happened here was, when ISKO couldn't get it here, because LENI came in, ang away na ay dito, which is still malawak. Malawak yung away pa rin, diba? I mean, there's so much to scramble for, right? That is why, if you're a centrist candidate in the Philippines, you're not gonna look at this blue. You're gonna look at this yellow. This is what you're gonna look at. This one will go to Bongbong Marcos, essentially, or Duterte, whatever. These gray ones. Much more comfortable with them. This one will go LENI, but itong dilaw dito sa gitna, yan ang pwede mong itap. This is where the median voter, you'll find it. Gets nyo ba? Now, of course, I'm simplifying it. I mean, I can discuss this a lot. I mean, you can still interrogate the data, the numbers, etc. I can pull more. But gusto ko lang mag-gets nyo na anong magiging political strategy ng isang kandidato na hindi invested doon sa dalawang camp. Ang titignan mo yung gitna, yung majority na gitna, the median voter, at doon mo itutugma yung strategiya mo, yung posturing mo, yung positioning mo, yung messaging mo. That is why, if you look at Isko Moreno, while he has emphasized human rights, while he has emphasized civil liberties, while he has emphasized yung dapat dissenting leader and all, at the same time, he makes a lot of moves and he says a lot of things that sound to the critics as Duterte light. So he's not trying to appeal to the gray here, he's trying to appeal to yung dilaw sa gitna. Hindi ito yung dilawan ng dilaw. Ito yung median voter. Gets nyo ba? Ito nga, Britain nga, na Boris Johnson pa sila eh. At US, mas mataas pa sa US, sa ano. So, what Biden did, kaya nga may laki yung chance ni Biden because may 40 ka na dito and then may dilaw ka pa dito. So, Biden could get much better yung chances ni Biden dito. But of course, I'm also simplifying because there's a parliamentary versus presidential, there's first past the post system. I'm simplifying it, but I'm trying to explain to you what we're talking about here, which is, if you are a centrist candidate, titignan mo yung dilaw na pinakita ko. Hindi mo titignan yung gray at saka yung blue. Now, you would try to pick a little bit pitik-pitik here and there, but actually, it's really yung gitna, yun ang titignan mo. Now, that is not static. As I said, the ground can shift over time. So my hunch is, I don't have the data, but if I pull it out, I won't be surprised if our numbers 15, 20 years ago were more like where South Korea is today. So back then, your median voter was quite different from your median voter, today, compared to then. And in the same way, in the US, for instance, again, you can have cross-sectional analysis. So, for instance, the median voters moved more to the left on issues like welfare, economic benefits, but on other issues, they moved to the right. I'm talking about the median voter, not yung hardcore Democrat, hardcore Trumpian, Republican, hindi ganun. Yung median voters. Yung mga softer supporters of Democrats, hindi mga Bernie, hindi mga Trumpy, mga ganun, hindi. Or mga independents, undecided, mga yan. So do you get what I'm saying here? So this is how you have to understand why ganyan yung parang seemingly contradictory at all over the place minsan yung mga sinasabi ng mga centrist candidate because they're deliberately trying to capture yung middle spectrum and at the same time trying to get some pitik-pitik here and there. And the moment that LENI ran, yung blue na yan, malabo na yan for ISKO. That's why ISKO had to re-pivot. And I think that pivot was very difficult for him. It stressed him a lot. I think nainis siya. I think may galit talaga dyan kay LENI. You can see the disappointment there. And lumabas na yan yung araw. Because my sense is, initially what they were looking at that. Now, I'm not sure they were looking at the same survey. But, they were looking at that and saying, okay, yung super hardcore na pupunta na kay Marcos yan. Hindi natin makukuha yan. Pero makukuha natin dito. Tapos kung makukuha din natin yung mga ibang blue dito, lagay natin dito, boom, we can get at least 40%. Malakas tayo. And in fact, some of the early surveys, like the Pulse Asia survey that had a four-way race among Sara, ISKO, etc., ISKO actually was winning that. Very interestingly. So Sara would get the gray, some of the yellow, and then here the yellow and blue, pupunta kay ISKO, boom, tapos ganun. But LENI ran. Bongbong ran, Sara didn't run. So Bongbong got the numbers, he got the gray, he had more yellow. Again, I'm simplifying it, but that way you understand what's going on. Okay? Yan. Ganyan po ang mag-political analysis. Hindi po yung ginagawa ng mga vloggers. Paano ba mag-explain ng mga vloggers? Ano ba yung mga nila? Yung mga chismisan, magpakita ng picture, mga asar-asar, mga bastos, tawag-tawag ng gano'n, banat this, banat that, ayan. Di tayo ganyan. Datos pong tinitignan natin. Now, I can pull more and more data to back up what I've been saying, but I'm trying to explain to you ano po yung basis to analyze anong pinanggagawa ng mga centrist candidate niyan. Kaya nga hirap na hirap. Now, this is also the challenge for ISKO because he's really treading a very, very, very treacherous kind of a field. At saka minefield yan. It's a very complicated situation. And for that, you need message discipline. You need communications discipline. Dapat airtight, diba? At yung suave yung transitions. Kung you're pegging from right to left on a certain issue, dapat suave. And I think that's where weaknesses have been exposed, including with ISKO. And if you're running for president, you have to really, have impulse control. You have to have, I can understand the frustration here kasi ang layo yung in-expect niya, ang layo yung situation niya ngayon. He still feels he can win something. Ang basa ko dito is, siguro yung ginawa dun sa press conference was trying to take out parang, okay, yung blue sa inyo na yan, but get some yellow to their side by attacking the blue. It looks like that's the strategy. I'm not sure that it worked because the execution, the operationalization was not optimal, right? So yun ang situation natin ngayon. So I hope now you get what I'm saying here. So this is the centrist playbook if you want to become the president, essentially, right? So obviously we're talking about quite different contexts here. But there are fundamental rules there that I think apply regardless of whether you're in Germany, you're in US, you're in the Philippines, etc. Because after all, we're all in a very similar information ecosystem. Now, what we're also realizing nowadays is that because of social media especially, but also other factors, economic factors among others, lalong lumalakas yung polarization ng ating politika. And in that situation, if you're non-centrist, let's call it conviction politics statesman. So LENI's conviction politics is what? Prevent the Marcoses, fight for human rights, etc. The Marcoses have their own version, which is redemption of their name, vindication, whatever, etc. Then your game plan is to make the race as polarized as possible and then keep your partisans as hardcore as possible and then attack the other side as much as possible, which is all exactly opposite of what the centrists want to do. What the centrists want to do is to say, huwag tayo magdamay sa mga away na yan. Let's focus on issues, on delivery of services, on competence and all. But this is also where na I felt ISKO didn't do as well as he should have done, because if you compare ISKO to Poe, he has many advantages na wala kay Poe. And I would say the biggest one is what you can call executive populism. One thing that ISKO has, which senators don't have, is this. As an executive, he has concrete projects, literally concrete projects. Condominium, Manila Hospital, all of this infrastructure projects in Manila and all of that. If he focused on that and tried to question the two other camps on the question of competence, yung husay, then I think it could have done better for him. But instead, ang nangyari dito is parang the attack became something else. And some would say almost personal attacks, etc. Some would even say misogynist attack, etc., etc. But in fairness kay ISKO, he also was on the offensive against the Marcoses. If you look at the presidential debates, he was very hard on the issue of real estate tax, among other things. But yun nga I think the strategy for the ISKO team should have been, and this is the playbook for anyone who wants to run as president and centrist, right? Balikan ko tong video na to mamaya. You focus on the husay question, get the middle who are not as ideologically oriented, and refocus them on the issue of delivery of services and all of that. And I think that is what karamihan ng mga service, yan ang mga pinapakita nila. Alright, okay. Andiyan pa ba kayo? Nagsimula tayo sa mean, mode, median, and then median voter, then centrism. So yun, level by level, nadidevelop natin yung argument. Nakikita nyo, di ba? Okay. Now, there's more to discuss here, but balik tayo sa buhay natin. I don't want to overwhelm you. So bukas, hopefully, there will be, kung may chance, a morning, try natin mag-catch up. Pag-usapan din natin yung ibang bansa na in the midst of elections at similar sa atin, especially Brazil. I'll talk about Brazil, and I'll tell you why it's important to talk about Brazil, because my next point will be related to that. Because in Brazil, they also have their Jair Bolsonaro, as their president, but there's a high chance that their next president will actually be someone from the left again, and no less than former President Lula, right? Lula has a very good chance of reclaiming the presidency and pushing back the levers of power to the left from the almost far right na meron tayo kay Bolsonaro. But one thing that is very important in Brazil is that mass unified yung opposition, mass consolidated yung opposition, mass crystallized yung on the ground grassroots movement, right? And I will explain to you what are the factors that contribute to that. I'm not going to go into culture and all of that, because Brazilian culture is very similar to Philippines, no? Brazilians are very much like us. We're very much like Brazilians, no? So I'm not going to go too much into cultural arguments. I'm going to go more into political economy. Now, going back to this, now, I see now there's this whole liberal hate ISKO fest going on there. And I can see how some people are enjoying this, trending na naman si Yormen kagabi, etc. And, if you look at this, for a moment, get out of it and look at this, sino ang happy dyan? Ang happy dyan ay si Bongbong Marcos. Because I do not see how this whole hate ISKO fest and ISKO's attack on LENI, which kind of triggered this whole thing, this latest episode, is going to help either of the two parties in any way significant enough to dent yung lead ni Bongbong Marcos. I think it hurt ISKO, but at the same time, I don't think it's helping as much LENI to catch up. So, at katulad ng sinabi natin dati, The best way for this race to be competitive is a three-way race, whereby ISKO consolidates the administration-friendly bloc, Bongbong Marcos with the Sara bloc, and then LENI with the progressive left bloc. Then you can have a competitive, more competitive three-way race, or 2.5-way race. Let's put it that way, right? But it looks like 2-3 weeks removed from the race. Nag-aaway yung number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, or yung 4, 5, 6, 7 ay inaaway yung number 2. I mean, like, kung ikaw ay si Bongbong Marcos ngayon, diba? Happy ka. Diba? Sino ba? Hindi na kailangan ng perfect attendance. Hindi na kailangan ng Oxford man, diba? Oh, diba? Easy na naman. Easy peasy win na naman yan. So, this is what I'm saying. Sige, labas nyo yung galit nyo sa isa't isa, yung mga ISKO camp na galit sa mga Dilawan, galit si ISKO. Sige, labas yung galit nyo. Labas nyo rin yung galit nyo kay ISKO. Sige, labas nyo rin. Sa dulo, paras kayong talo. Paras kayong talo. You know, what's happening now is worse than what happened in 2016. In 2016, na-split yung vote ng liberal left or liberal center left between Grace po and Mar. Kaya nanalo si Digong. Pag sinama mo yung boto ni Peo at saka Grace po at saka Mar, mas malaki. Mas malaki dapat kay Digong. But hindi. Nag-away, nag-split. And then my hate po the festival, and then the other camp attacking Mar and all. And sa dulo nanalo si Tatay Digong. This time, it can end up even worse for the opposition. And again, keep in mind, your median voter is not as invested in ideological debates. Yes, I personally am fully committed to human rights and democracy and all. I'm very much, very much, you know, I find it deplorable yung nangyari, all of these human rights violations and all of yeah. At the same time, you have to win the race and you have to understand the lay of the land before you can win the race, di ba? At dito dapat maintindihan mo yung median voter. So dito sa discussion natin over the past, 35-40 minutes, we went through the concepts, basic concepts, some basic data, and we tried to understand this 360 degrees from the point of view of different sides. And nakikita din natin dito yung weaknesses ng different sides. And at the end of the day, if current trend lines continue, this is going to be an easy peasy win para kay Principe, diba? Good Machiavellian, diba? Perfect attendance. Oxford man. Yan tayo. Ayan tayo. Okay. Kaya sabi ko, kailangan ko mag-meditate bago mag-meta-meta sa inyo kasi